Let's talk about what's happening in 2025. This is your year ahead forecast for the year 2025. And the best way to describe this year is that this year is an overture for what comes after. An overture in music is this movement of music that happens before an opera or something that will go over the major musical themes and sounds and musical storylines before we head into a multi-journey with characters and story, and we watch the music evolve into something entirely different. We participate with it, and it participates in us, and our experience offers us a journey and a sense of catharsis and moves us temporarily or permanently in a new way of being. So 2025 functions like this for the decade and a half that follows. The primary reason for that is that we start huge themes as demonstrated by the ingresses of the outer planets, nearly all in the same year, into new signs, where they will spend many years developing the stories. And so not only is that the beginning of new stories, but it is also the end of old stories, of old journeys. They will begin the year in their old signs. They will each move in to their new signs. And then Saturn and Neptune and Uranus will all retrograde back into their previous signs in the fall. So we move forward, we get a taste of this new world order and this new overture of theme and the way that the world will change. And we see it, we stand on the vista, we look out at the Pride Lands with Mufasa, and then we go back for a moment to tie up the loose ends once the reality of the journey that we will be on sets in and we figure out how to change the story, how we're going to adjust and how we're going to meet the world. And so this year is this pivotal moment where things will start and things will end, and we will get the scent of the collective future in a new way that we won't necessarily fully step into until 2026. By far the most significant transits of 2025 are the ingresses of the planets Neptune, Saturn, Uranus, and Pluto newly ingressed into Aquarius in the first moment of Aquarius. So we have the outer planets in new signs. We will also experience the shift of both Saturn, which happens around every 2.5, 3 years, and Jupiter, which happens yearly, but still significant in this year of all of the ingresses. We will have eclipses wrapping up their happenings in the sign of Aries. We already had our last Libra eclipse, we'll have our last Aries eclipse, and we will have a full opening and the nodes shifting into the signs of Virgo and Pisces. So we'll have 2 eclipse seasons that bring us fresh storylines. We will have the close of the Aries Libra eclipse. We will have Mercury retrogrades in fire and water signs. So the first one will Mercury will station retrograde in Aries, retrograde back into Pisces. The second one is fully contained within the sign of Leo, and then the third one will station retrograde in Sagittarius and retrograde back into Scorpio. We also have a Venus retrograde in the sign of Aries, and we will have the second half of Mars retrograde in the sign of Leo and Cancer. So those are the headlines. Where things get very interesting, and where I would like to draw your attention, first, for the purposes of being fairly succinct in this year ahead forecast, I will have in-depth rising sign based year aheads, which will drop on New Year's. I'm trying to get to all of them. If you're waiting for yours and don't see it, shoot me a line. Sometimes that is the inspiration I need to make it happen. Okay, we head into January with the building opposition between Mars and Pluto. Part of the storyline of Mars's retrograde is this opposition with Pluto. We had the first one at the beginning of November when Mars was in Cancer, still moving direct, but very slowly, and Pluto was still in Capricorn. They had their opposition. The second one, Mars stationed retrograde on December 6th of 2024 and is moving into an exact opposition with Pluto, who is now ingressed into Aquarius. So now we have a new context for this opposition. We have Pluto in the sign of the masses, in the sign of the collective, in the sign of humanity, opposing Mars retrograde in Leo, in the sign of leadership, in the sign of the hero, in the sign of the individual standing out against that, right? We are having moments where the power of the masses is coming into confrontation with the effort and the will of leaders. And this is very tense. And we can see some interesting, potentially very inflammatory themes begin here. And this is the beginning of Pluto's ingress into Aquarius, where Pluto will be until 2044. So as one of the initiatory ingresses right around the new year comes into a kind of peak, where we will see a lot of political tension. And I would also expect to see, with Pluto and Aquarius and the ways that technology is changing very quickly and technology can be used to control the individual, we will see Pluto opposing Mars and Leo's desire to express itself fully. So we might see crackdowns on social media, what you're allowed to say on social media. We might see TikTok taken away in the United States. The days after that, Mars will retrograde back into Cancer. And from January 6th until April 17th, Mars will be retrograde and then direct in the sign of Cancer, in the sign of its fall, in the sign of frustration and helplessness, especially when it comes to Mars in retrograde, unable to move forward. There might be some despair that's associated with that and a lot of frustration. On the other hand, we have Venus very quickly after the new year move into her sign of exaltation in Pisces. And one of the beautiful things about this year is that Venus will spend a full 2 months in Pisces. She will station retrograde in Aries at the very beginning on March 1st. She spends 2 months in Aries in the sign of her detriment, but bookending that transit is a full month in Pisces in January and another full month in Pisces after she stations direct in April, where that kind of gives us a sense of hopefulness and beneficence and the power of faith and a little bit of buoyancy. Now, that's not to say that it's all roses, because she is wrestling with Saturn, and as she moves into Pisces, she will spend much of it conjunct Saturn. But in the sign of her exaltation, she is bringing magical solutions and support to Saturn. And Venus and Saturn together are making deep commitments about what their values are and what they're willing to persevere for. So This is a time, especially in the beginning of the year with Venus and Pisces, to think within yourself, to get in touch with that inner world, and to really listen with your intuition as to what you care about and what is really worth serving during this time period of such disorder and upheaval as old structures are put under strain. Mars will station direct on February 24th at 17 degrees of Cancer. Will be stopped there in the sky, putting pressure on these Cancerian points, and then moving forward again. But that should be a pivotal moment. And then, as I said, in the beginning of March, Venus will station retrograde around 10 degrees of Aries. And then a couple weeks later, we will have our first Virgo lunar eclipse that happens at 23 degrees of Virgo on March 14th. And right almost, I think it's within 24 hours, Mercury will station retrograde at around 10 degrees of Aries. And she's in the sign of Aries, in the sign of what we fight for, deciding what is worth fighting for, deciding what she wants, deciding how to be direct about it, possibly. Mercury is following suit, stationing retrograde at almost exactly the same degree. Starts moving backwards again. And we're in the eclipse portal, so we've opened up the eclipse portal with that Virgo lunar eclipse that is having us check on the Virgo area of our life. If you don't know where that falls in your chart, take your rising sign and watch my rising sign as archetypal life path videos, and I will find Virgo in your chart for you and talk about some of the ways that might show up. It's a lunar eclipse on the south node, which means we're shedding old stories that no longer serve us. And so part of the illumination of that eclipse is understanding and seeing with clear eyes how something may no longer serve us. So that can be unsettling, it can be surprising, and we're still in the eclipse portal where it's more important to be checking out the lay of the land than necessarily taking action, especially with all of these retrograde planets and Mars still in the shadow of its retrograde. At the very end of March, we have two things happen. One is our final Aries eclipse, which happens at around 10 degrees of Aries. So we have this concentration, both of Venus's station and Mercury's and the eclipse. There is something happening at 10 degrees of the cardinal sign. So if you have planets or angles there, either in Aries but also in Libra or Cancer or Capricorn, the first part of this year is a lot of tension around the cardinal signs in some state of duress because of Mars's retrograde in Cancer and all of the shifts and all of the stuff building in Aries. This is our third solar eclipse. So Aries has received 3 different solar eclipses, which is a lot because solar eclipses have to do with new beginnings. These are also North Node eclipses. This is what we're gathering more of into the world, into our lives, how we're gathering it. And this is Aries, the exaltation of the sun. We have had the sun in its sign of exaltation becoming eclipsed and welcoming in these new versions of a self that we have been sensing and longing for since the ingress of Chiron into Aries that was touching the wound in our sense of self, in our gift of spontaneity, in our ability to take action towards things. So we've been welcoming in this new space, especially wherever you have Aries in your chart, has been undergoing a lot of new beginnings, which can also mean erasing everything to begin again. And this will be our 3rd year in a row of these Aries eclipses, and the final one. Hopefully the 3rd time is the charm in terms of your emergent self getting to show up and create a foothold in this space. Basically, concurrently to that eclipse, we will have Neptune step into Aries, and Neptune will be in Aries for around 14 years, I think, a decade and a half of Neptune in Aries. Neptune tends to make things magical, kind of put on these rose-tinted glasses on certain areas. And where that is very interesting in the sign of Aries is that Aries is the war sign, the military sign, the sign of the soldier, the strength and youth of the soldier. And Neptune going into that space, I imagine that we will see a rise in the culture's estimation of self-defense, of weaponry, of military might and strength, right? You can see globally things building in tensions. Neptune has not been in Aries since the United States Civil War. And so we will see many stories play out during Neptune's time there. But the beginning, this first half of the year, and I imagine pieces of the next decade and a half, will see high conflict and Delulu stuff about conflict, because that is what Neptune is doing. It's remaking things in the shadows, changing our image so we can both idealize things and not understand them with Neptune in Aries. Now, on the other hand, that also means that Neptune is leaving Pisces. Neptune is leaving the watery, magical sign of Pisces that saw such a rise in the practice of astrology and spiritual witchcraft and all of these intuitive arts, but also of opioid pandemics and the desire for numbing and softening and escapism. Midway through April, Mars will leave the sign of Cancer and enter Leo. So still in one of the signs of its retrograde. It enters Leo, and of course, as it re-enters Leo, it begins to build again this opposition with Pluto, this third opposition with Pluto as part of this retrograde cycle that will culminate around the end of April. And by May 1st, Mars will leave the shadow of its retrograde, but it still will not ingress into a new sign. It will not ingress into Virgo until mid-June. So since September of 2024, all the way until June 17th of 2025, we have Mars really digging in its heels and working something out in the story of Cancer and Leo, and facing down fierce adversaries in the form of Pluto. By the end of May, we have Saturn on May 24th entering Aries as well. So Saturn moves into Aries, and Saturn in Aries is in the sign of its fall. When planets are in the sign of their fall, it is the place where they struggle the most to express this. Saturn is elderly, it takes a long time, rules over things that take a long time, wants to do things patiently and methodically with a lot of discipline. So is at odds with the spontaneity and youthfulness of Aries. Saturn is good at finding problems. On the negative side, that can make it so we either burn out because we're pushing ourselves too hard on something that's unsustainable, or we never get started because Saturn douses the fire before it even starts moving. Saturn also is weight and obligation and oppressiveness. And when we have a planet that is about the weight of oppression in warlike Aries, it is willing to use weapons in destructive ways that it might not otherwise. It will be building and building towards a conjunction with Neptune over the summer, but they will not complete the conjunction. They'll get within a degree, so very close. We've been feeling the weight of the co-presence of Saturn and Neptune in the same sign for several years now, and we will continue to have them in the same sign because Saturn will spend the next 3 years in Aries, and they will complete their conjunction in 2020. On June 9th, Jupiter will enter Cancer and leave the sign of Gemini, where it has been frenetic, trying to find the right solutions to harvest the right ideas, and become slightly overwhelmed by how fragmented everything seems, especially in Gemini, that's always collecting more details and more information. Right? It's been expanding our access to all of these technological tools. When it moves into Cancer, Jupiter will be in the sign of its exaltation. So the opposite, right? And so when planets are in the sign of their rulership, they can function in a straightforward way because they're very comfortable. They're in signs that are in accord with their nature. The sign of their exaltation is where they are the most productive in some ways. I don't mean a capitalistic sense of production, but where they are very supported in what they represent. Jupiter in Cancer, I think, will be a balm post-Mars retrograde that saw so much conflict and frustration and lack of progress in the sign of Cancer. Jupiter in Cancer is the support and the well-being, the nurturing, and the fertility within the sign of Cancer. And there's a gorgeous new moon that happens right around the summer solstice. It is the Cancer new moon, so the moon rules the sign of Cancer. I always think of the Cancer new moon as the moon's birthday, but it is conjunct an exalted Jupiter. So just a really beautiful, auspicious new moon. And one of the most gorgeous things about it is that Pluto will not be in Capricorn. It's not even opposite by sign, this new moon. And so in some ways, the end of Pluto in Capricorn was also the end of Pluto opposing Cancer. And so Cancer almost gets a new coronation with Jupiter. And Jupiter serves as a nice ally, right? If we're going to have the greater malefic, Saturn, in the sign of its fall, having the greater benefic, Jupiter, in the sign of its exaltation, is a beautiful support. And even before this new moon, there's a really wonderful day where we have Venus and the moon in Taurus. So Venus in her sign of rulership, the moon in her sign of exaltation, Venus and the moon conjunct in Taurus, and Jupiter and the sun conjunct in Cancer. Just a really sweet and soft space for these softer parts of our chart. So that's one thing that I'm looking forward to this summer. In July, we will have Uranus move from Taurus into Gemini. And from its first steps over the threshold in Gemini, it will begin a sign-based trine to Pluto. Uranus and Gemini will accelerate technology, and the trine with Pluto will only be supportive to that. We will see the world remade in this way for good or worse, right? Maybe the sum total of all of it always stays the same, and it changes forms, and it moves through forms, and we each get our own part to play in the great story of whatever this is, and it's probably beyond our understanding. Uranus will move into Gemini, and that historically has been very significant for the United States the Revolutionary War, had Uranus in Gemini, the Civil War. Uranus was in Gemini, and our involvement in World War II was timed by Uranus in Gemini. So again, these warlike things. And it's interesting to note, it is in war that we develop lots of new technologies. All of those wars remade the shape of the United States. We are likely to see that again, and it probably will not be remade gently. It's not about being doomy, it is just about being aware. That is the pattern we're looking at. By the end of July, Mercury will station retrograde. In Leo, this one happens entirely in Leo. Mercury will actually station direct at the beginning of Leo, very close to the degree that Mars stationed retrograde. In some ways, our full cerebral integration of whatever that storyline was might wait until July and August. In the beginning of September, we have Saturn, which went retrograde over the summer, retrograde back into Pisces. We will have a Pisces lunar eclipse that happens on September. Yes. Yeah, so it'll be interesting because we will have a Virgo new moon that happens at 0 degrees of Virgo that will not be eclipsed. And then September 7th, we will have a Pisces full moon that will be a lunar eclipse. So again, we're touching back into that Pisces part of our chart. We've already had one Pisces lunar eclipse that happened at the end of September of 2024. This is the only eclipse season within the Virgo-Pisces eclipse cycle that is just Virgo-Pisces. This one in September of 2025, we get a Pisces lunar eclipse, and then at the very end, we get a Virgo solar eclipse at 29 degrees of Virgo, opposite Saturn at 28 degrees of Pisces. This is such a fascinating eclipse to me because it's the only solar eclipse in the whole Virgo-Pisces cycle. And solar eclipses have to do with new beginnings, as I said, but it is a solar eclipse on the south node, which minimizes things, takes them out of the world, shows us where they're no longer alive. It's at the 29 degrees of the sign. It's at the anaretic degree. We're beginning something in the 11th hour. And it's opposite Saturn, which halts things and oppositions themselves are of the nature of Saturn. There's a stalemate. It's like a little blip. It's like a chemical pregnancy. It's okay, there was a beginning, but it actually wasn't a beginning at all. I'll be really interested to see how that shows up in people's lives, if it really is a beginning or if it's just a kind of belly flop. We will have Neptune retrograde back into Pisces and Uranus retrograde back into Taurus. Mars will be humming along, now moving through the signs fairly frequently. We will have a retrograde of Mercury in the sign of Sagittarius back into the sign of Scorpio. We wrap up the year with many of the planets in the position that they started in at the very end of these signs. Not Pluto, notably. Pluto is done retrograding back into Capricorn, is now fully in Aquarius. And obviously Jupiter is not going to retrograde back into Gemini. But we will have Saturn, Neptune, and Uranus all back in the signs that they started the year. We will see Mars and the Sun and Venus building towards a triple conjunction in Capricorn that will perfect just after the new year in 2026. And so why that is significant is that we had this major struggle with Mars in its retrograde opposite Pluto in the sign of its fall, and yet it wraps up the year in Capricorn in the sign of its exaltation, fully in its power, able to push things forward in its own space. So that is the year ahead. Thank you for being with me. Feel free to post your questions and comments And for a more personalized thing, you can check out my rising sign year ahead videos. And if you want to get down to the nitty gritty, I would love to look at your personal chart and go over your transits for the year. You can book year ahead readings through my website. Happy New Year.